Hello and welcome to the third session for Sport England, Resilience and the Road to Recovery. My name's Dr. Jim Rogers and today's session is all about pedagogy and mastery. So just a reminder, in part one we established some starting points. So what we need to consider in terms of students' well-being and their psychological and physiological place that they may be in during school closures at the moment and as schools begin to reopen. In part two, we covered what we need to consider, I think, in terms of supporting students as they come back into school, that importance of being in a place of safety and security in order to support their resilience, the importance of team and connectivity and social interaction, and also the implications for you as staff as we go forward, and this idea that behaviour and our physiological state is contagious. Today's session is much more focused on pedagogy and learning, with a particular kind of context, I suppose, in terms of teaching remotely and considering the things that we need to think about as students come back into school. So today is around pedagogy and mastery, and what we can use from sport as well to develop that kind of mastery approach. So what I'd like to do is just start with some very simple learning theory. So I'm hoping that for most of you, this is just a reminder. There will be some references at the end of some resources that you can look at. Dead easy, simple resources you can look at to support your understanding as well. But what I want to do is go through the basics of learning theory. It's really important. When we talk about learning, we're talking about developing contextual understanding in our long-term memory. And we're going to talk a lot over the first part of this session about short-term or working memory and long-term memory. Cognition, you may have heard of that term before, is the actual kind of mental process of knowing, thinking, understanding and learning. Schools and school leaders and teachers often talk about metacognition. Now, metacognition is a bit of a holy grail. Is a really interesting implication right now as students are working away from schools. So metacognition is when we're leading our own learning, aware of our own learning needs and managing and leading our own learning. So my view on this is that metacognition can't take place unless the basics of cognition and learning are fully understood. So, as I said, learning is the conceptual understanding that's stored in our long-term memory. We have kind of two elements to our memory, as far as we know. The first is our short-term or working memory. It's how we process the sensory inputs that we have. And actually that process is limited. So we have a limited capacity in terms of how much we can process at any one time. It's called cognitive load, and we've all experienced it. So the reason why these 3 sessions are quite short is because I think they're more accessible for you as busy professionals, and I don't want to overload you with information so that it has little impact. The amazing thing is it would appear that our long-term memory is limitless. All of us, unless we have a very specific condition, we appear to have limitless long-term memory. That means all of your learners have a limitless capacity to learn. They might learn at different rates and in different ways, although there's not such a thing as learning styles. That's another presentation. But our long-term memory is limitless. One absolutely fundamental element of this is that we connect learning new concepts and ideas to prior learning. So as we develop a kind of repertoire of experience and expertise as a learner, we have more things to hang our learning on, if you can picture that. And that's got big implications in terms of how you teach, how you plan, how you deliver or design medium-term planning and schemes of work, and particularly the opportunity that this provides us at the minute during school closures. I'll come back to that in a second. So just in a sort of another diagrammatical representation, what we've got here in terms of these three boxes is an idea, or the kind of the process of how we move information from a kind of sensory input, our sensory store, which is grabbing somebody's attention, processing that in our short-term store or short-term memory, that kind of working memory, and then transferring that to our long-term memory. And as I said, we only do that when we can connect it to prior learning. We might rehearse and practice within our kind of working memory as we're doing something live, but it's the transfer and retrieval, so the transfer to and the retrieval from long-term memory, where we begin to embed learning and kind of consolidate learning. And what appears to be absolutely crucial in this process is forgetting and also making mistakes. So forgetting is a really, really important part of learning. And I'm going to come to that in a second. It would appear, and this is just a general rule of thumb, that our working memory and that kind of cognitive load, that limited capacity, is around about 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. So we're talking about between 5 and 9 new pieces of information at any one time is about the limit of which we can process. And that information is stored, as I said, is linked to prior learning, but it's stored as meaning. It's stored as understanding. Although we can store facts and we can learn by kind of rote and memory, that doesn't allow us conceptual understanding. That's really, really important to understand. As I said just now, making mistakes is a crucial part of learning. And if you've gone through drills and that deliberate practice of developing technique in sport, you'll understand that you develop expertise through making mistakes and correcting them. It's even better when somebody is helping you with that process. So somebody is able to watch and coach and feedback on what needs to be corrected. And it's even better again if you are able to reflect and then adjust what you're doing in order to improve. So making mistakes, feedback and self-reflection are three really important parts of learning. And of course some of those things are a little bit challenged at the minute during school closures. One of the other things that we know is that information appears to be chunked in terms of how it's drawn back or retrieved from our long-term memory. And equally, if we chunk information that goes to a long-term memory, so we chunk information that's provided to our learners into smaller pieces, they're more likely to be able to access that than rather than one big piece of information in any one go. And as I said, forgetting is a crucial part of learning, and it's something that many learners don't like doing. Many of us don't like making mistakes, many of us don't like forgetting something, but it's super, super important. So let's just talk about memory. There was an educational researcher, a scientist called Ebbinghaus, who did some interesting work on memory. He created kind of nonsensical words. He created words that wouldn't make sense in any language and tried to memorize them. And what he discovered was that his ability to retain information exponentially dropped over a period of about 7 days. That exponential loss has big implications for us as teachers. It proves that unless we're doing something to repeat prior learning and revisit prior learning and embed that, we just can't store or retain that information. But what he also discovered was that through repetition, and he did this repetition over a number of weeks, that repetition enabled the learner, first of all himself and then others in his tests, to retain more and more information. And if you look at this graph, over a 5-week period, retention is around about 75, perhaps even more, 80%. Now, there's different names for this. It's often called spaced repetition or distributed repetition, and you may have heard of this before. It's closely linked to retrieval practice, where we ask our learners to retrieve prior learning before we start a lesson. The key thing is that if you're able to build in revisiting prior learning, then that could be a week ago, a month ago, last term, last year, in your lessons in a systematic way, you are far more likely to have learning kind of stored and embedded in your learners, or understanding embedded with your learners. And I think at the minute that is a huge opportunity for us, as we're going to struggle to teach new concepts remotely. Okay, we're going to come to that in a moment, but actually we've got a massive opportunity to revisit prior learning and embed that with our learners during school closures and as we begin to reopen. So it's a bit of an opportunity that we would never have had before because of time constraints. So I should see this as a real positive opportunity. Now, if we just think back over the last couple of presentations, one of the big messages that I've pushed is around the importance of relationships and well-being, so where our learners feel safe and secure and able to learn. So what I don't want to do is kind of muddy the water with anything, but for me, learning theory is going to be pointless without any understanding of how to develop and maintain positive learning relationships. And that's equally important now as we consider pedagogical principles. So for me, these principles, these are the things that I would normally train teachers to understand at a really, really high level. So if you're an expert teacher, these are the things that you do really, really well on a day-to-day basis. I've highlighted those things in black that I think of particular resonance or importance at the minute. So let's take instruction. A really good reference point is Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction. There's an article that I can send alongside this presentation about that. There's a book by Tom Sherrington, which is called Rosenshine's Principles in Action. Either way, instruction is a really important part of teaching. And right now, I would suggest that the accuracy and precision in your instruction is absolutely crucial. It has implications in terms of how your learners receive and understand that instruction and how they engage. And I'm going to explain that with the polyvagal chart in a moment. But I think that instruction at the minute, clarity, precision in your communication is crucial. We've also got an opportunity to use technology to help us model practice. So there are lots and lots of YouTube clips, there's things that you can create yourself to actually show how somebody needs to do something. And we know that modelling is a really important pedagogical principle. We show what success looks like. We show how to do something before somebody practices it. Now, I haven't got deliberate practice in bold, but I would say that deliberate practice is important, but what we can't do is manage it particularly easily from a distance at the minute. I think if you can create opportunities for your students to practice what you're modelling, I think that's really good. But obviously it's much, much harder. But feedback is absolutely crucial at the minute. Now just think back to the second session where we talked about the importance of connectivity in teams. Well, actually feedback is fundamental in that. If you're a student, you're working at home, and you don't really see the point, and you might want to slack off. And if you don't think that the teacher is actually that aware of what you're doing, you're going to disengage. So feedback is important in terms of connectivity. What we've also discovered is that feedback alongside retrieval practice improves motivation. So there's a lot of research to suggest that both revisiting prior learning, so feeling that you're getting some success, getting some feedback from your teacher is going to encourage your students to engage. So there's some really good research about that in terms of motivation. Questioning is a tough one at the minute, so your questioning would need to be quite generic and difficult to kind of direct or target to your individuals. But challenge is crucial. So a lot of work that I do with teachers is about challenge. One default some teachers fall into is thinking that they've got to teach to the weakest and then kind of provide those extension activities to the more able students. Well, actually, if you look at it the other way around, we want to have really high expectation of our learners, and we need to get the right level of challenge in order for success to happen. The reason I've got it in bold is because I think it's really hard, but I think it's one of the things that we've got to try and get really, really right at the minute. If you make your online activities too difficult, your students are going to disengage. You make it too easy, they're going to disengage as well. So you need to, just as who was it, the three bears and the three bowls of porridge, it just needs to be just right. Okay, so I'm raising it because it's something I think you need to consider. Now, we talked about retrieval practice a lot already, but I think that every single taught lesson, whether that's taught online or taught back in the classroom, needs to begin with revisiting prior learning and allowing your learners to retrieve that information. So it could be through low stakes quizzing, for example. Read Mary Myatt's book on that, on low stakes, high challenge, I think it's called. But just consider how you create the environment for people to revisit prior learning. We've talked about cognitive load. So again, from a learner's perspective, how much information are you giving at any one time? The social construction of knowledge, for me, is a pedagogical principle that is very difficult at the minute. But we will talk about in a minute about the importance of live lessons and what that can do to contribute. Now, for me, there's a huge opportunity at the minute to support the metacognitive skills of your learners. The metacognitive skills of your learners. I'm beginning to sound like a robot. I think the demands placed on our learners to manage their own learning is huge at the minute. And the more we can do to support that and guide our learners and help them understand just how successful they are, I think the better they're going to be as they come back into school. Now, clearly not all of our learners are engaged at the minute, but those that are demonstrating some really high levels of metacognition. Oops, sorry, I didn't realise I'd done that. Okay, I've referred to this chart in every session that I've delivered to you so far, and I just want to reiterate a couple of points with you. And this, I'll be honest with you, this is coming from the perspective of a parent as well as an educationist and a teacher. What I've experienced is that when teachers get the instruction wrong, and there's an ambiguity, or there's just poor levels of instruction in a task, because everything else at the minute is heightened in terms of a kind of stress and lack of normality, that triggers a learner into that fight or flight really, really quickly, particularly our teenagers. Okay, so poor instruction, a mismatch in challenge, or cognitive overload, and an overload in terms of that kind of whole learning experience is going to very quickly push our learners into fight or flight, and over a sustained period of time is just going to completely disengage our learners. And I give you some really simple examples. We've had instructions or tasks given to our kids where graphs are shown one way round and then they're shown the other way round, or it refers to the green box when in fact it's the blue box, or somebody has taken a screenshot and used that as a worksheet so the student can't write in any of the boxes because it's not on a Word document. So all of the little things, the sweating the detail, I think is really important at the minute. Otherwise, we are just going to push our students into a place where they can't engage. So I've mentioned metacognition. We are, by virtue of the fact that all of our learners most of our learners are at home, we're demanding huge levels of metacognition. And even those that are coming back into school, because learning is going to look different probably in the next 6 months at least, and schools are going to look different, and teachers are going to be facilitating other subjects and content, our opportunity and the importance of supporting our students with metacognition is really, really important. There is a potential that this is going to push our students into a defensive mode. So we need to consider how we deliver our pedagogical principles to really, really high standard to ensure that we don't get to that point of the defense mode. And I would say again that your opportunity to feed back really high quality and personalized is really, really important. We had a reward card sent home for one of our kids the other day, and it was brilliant. It was a subject that one of the kids struggled with, and it just really, really hit the mark. It was just at the right time. Having said that, that's one card in 2 months, which for me is probably not enough coming from the school and from the teachers. Now, this I appreciate is tricky, okay, and not all students have IT access, and we have a big concern about the widening gap between our disadvantaged learners and other learners. But where you have an opportunity to deliver online, particularly if your school allows video to be used as opposed to just audio, you are creating an opportunity for interaction, and you're also creating an opportunity for questions to be asked and answered. Talking to my colleagues in Copenhagen and Denmark, live teaching has been done right from the beginning. There hasn't been any of this kind of lists of homework being set. And it also places a kind of demand on attendance. So if you're going to deliver a live lesson at a particular time, your student has to be there. So it provides a bit of a structure and routine for your learners as well. Now, I just wanted to talk about mastery. It was one of the original requests for this session. I'm really, really interested in this, and my interest was triggered in several different ways. One is through my own sporting interest, particularly because I'm not very good at anything. So I've always been interested in why some people are able to reach an elite level and others can't, and whether it's just a physical thing or whether there's other elements to it. Another thing that's piqued my interest has been a book that you may well have read by Matthew Syed called Bounce. Now, Matthew Syed is a sports journalist for the Times, or was. He was a Commonwealth table tennis player, and he was interested in why a number of international level table tennis players came from his street and the neighbouring streets of the town that he grew up in. And he identified a number of factors that contributed to mastery and expertise taking place. Now, I won't go into all of those now, but I'm just going to touch on a few. I've got here, just to mention as well, you may have come across this at the same time or prior to him publishing that book, but at a similar time, there was research coming from the States about 10,000 hours being what's required to become an expert at something. So Matthew Syed kind of tested that idea. I can guarantee to you that if I was to play tennis for 10,000 hours, I would not reach an international level. Not if I did it on my own. If I had somebody to coach me, and if we go back to some of the principles we discussed earlier, if that coaching allowed for deliberate practice, if modelling took place, if I was particularly good at responding to that feedback and translating that into a physical response, I may become really good. I doubt whether I'd ever become elite, and I'm certainly too old to be elite now anyway. But the ingredients, you start getting the ingredients required to become a master. So some of it is environmental, the opportunities that are provided to you in terms of equipment and rehabilitation and sports injury and nutrition and all the rest of it. But a lot of it is down to the quality of coaching that's provided to an individual. We also know that, and I've mentioned this before, that we socially construct our knowledge and understanding. So as a species, we are so successful because we are able to communicate ideas and learn from one another. And again, the reason I'm saying this is because right now that's really, really tricky. So we just need to consider how we can promote that kind of sense of not just resilience but mastery through the connectivity that we have. I would say that this approach requires high levels of social emotional aspects of learning, that emotional literacy that's required to learn from another person. And there's been some interesting research to suggest that it's much harder to read emotion through a PC, through a computer screen, via Zooms or Teams or whatever it may be. We also have to create the environment where we're prepared to fail and learn, and to take risk. Now, I've got a picture here of Jessica Ennis-Hill and a coach, and I don't know if you've ever considered this, but it's always been interesting to me that even our very best athletes working at the very highest level will have a coach with them during competition. And that's because there's always that need for a second perspective, for that access to expertise and that guidance and that kind of that coaching even during competition. So again, I think, I've said this before, but I think from your perspective as sports and PE teachers, you can have a huge part to play in the next steps of the recovery phase for schools. Okay, so I just want to go through a summary of key points from the 3 sessions, just to remind you. Students, I think, are quite likely to be experiencing different levels of trauma during social isolation and school closure. So I don't think that they will necessarily recognise that themselves, but I think we have to expect that many of our students and some of our staff will be experiencing this at the minute. Learning, resilience and mastery, I think, can only take place if students feel safe, connected and can trust you. So all of this depends on the quality of relationships that you can create for your learners. I think developing a sense of team and being proactive in our actions in order to provide that connectivity is really important. This idea that your behaviour is contagious, I want you just to remind yourselves that being calm, solution focused and open-minded at the minute is what we need from you as professionals. I think online learning is providing a huge opportunity for us to revisit prior learning. It's also enabling us to model and instruct in different ways as well. And it could also be a brilliant tool to share expertise with each other. And in terms of our kind of pedagogical approach, I think there's a huge demand on you at the minute to be very precise, to sweat the detail, sweat the small stuff in terms of how you instruct and how you communicate, ensuring that you've got the kind of optimal challenge, and try and create those opportunities for feedback as well. What we don't want to do is be pushing our learners into that kind of defense mode too quickly. So this is my last slide, and this refers to a number of resources that I've mentioned during the last 3 presentations. The top one is growing by the week at the minute. I think there are now 7 sessions on there, but there's going to be more by the time you access it. It's Ian Hunkin, a colleague of mine that works across at Sigma Teaching School. He's producing some fantastic resources, and many of the things that I've talked about in these 3 sessions have been informed by his material, and he's going into those things in much more detail, particularly around vulnerable students, the impact of trauma, and that idea about feeling safe and secure. You will have come across the Education Endowment Foundation before, I'm sure, but they are producing a number of very relevant resources at the minute to support teachers, school leaders, but also to support parents as well, so that's worth a look. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about learning theory, some really good simple things to look at are 3 short films prepared by David Didao, who calls himself the Learning Spy, that he created for the BBC, so there's a link there. And I've mentioned some podcasts that I'm doing for Teachers Hall Council South West. It's a whole new world for me trying to do podcasts, but yeah, it's been a really interesting experience, and there's some really interesting people on there as well, and hopefully you'll find those of useful as well. They're available through my website, but also through the Southwest CPD portal that link should take you to. So that's the end of the 3 sessions. I wish you all well. I really do hope that I get an opportunity to meet you all in person and perhaps lead some training in your schools in the future. I think that might be a bit of a way off yet, but I strongly believe that coming from a physical education, sport and outdoor education approach to what we can understand and gain from that in terms of our expertise has got a huge amount of to offer at the minute for all staff, and particularly in supporting our learners. So yeah, I wish you all well, take good care, and hopefully I'll see you sometime soon. Bye bye.